This is a conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jenny Stefanotti about the Consilience Project. And it is part of a series of conversations within Dent, which is a co-learning community that convenes several times a week on Clubhouse. And the conversation starts putting the discussion in the context of the broader and ongoing inquiry, and then gets into why this particular project is a very important leverage point in the very significant systemic and existential challenges that humanity faces today. We had the conversation just on the heels of the launch of the beta of the project. It's very much in need of support and resources. So we hope that you will enjoy the discussion, and we hope that you will be inclined to support us. You can find out more at denttogether.org and consilienceproject.org. I always like to say that the scope of the Dent inquiry is this foundational base layer of society. And we obviously have a focal point around economic institutions, given the massive impact of capitalism on society, but you can't talk about reforming economics without talking about the political institutions that create the rules for the markets, or the cultural beliefs and values that it's filtered through. And of course, the enormous role that technology plays in redefining that playing field. I might think of that as a foundational layer, but if you look at the problems that face humanity today, there's really a layer beneath that, which gets into how those institutions get created and reformed in the first place. And that's really where Daniel is focused today. So I'm so thrilled to welcome you back. I'm honored to have you again. He's actually really been heads down since we talked in August. He's really just an extraordinarily brilliant mind with a heart that's almost as big. And so it's a great delight to talk with you. He's a close colleague of Jordan Hall and Forrest Landry's, who we've also had on Dent a couple of times. Jordan and Forrest and Daniel really took a lot of the early ideas of Game B and evolved that thinking. And so last August, Daniel came on and we talked kind of about the epistemic crisis. This was the first of a series of conversations where we were really looking at social media and the internet and how that affected the information commons. And then we honed in a little bit more, talking about social media and democracy, and then honed in a little bit more, talking about free speech and content moderation. But the conversation with Daniel really kicked that off, and we talked about the epistemic crisis. The bulk of the conversation was about that, and then we got into the Consilience Project. But really, Consilience actually addresses a little bit of a wider lens than the epistemic crisis, which is problem solving. It's not just how do we access information to assess reality as we understand it, but then also how do we work at both an individual and collective capacity to problem solve. And that's really the challenge that Consilience is focused on. We'll talk about the Consilience Project today. Just disclosure that I am an advisor to the project. And so first, Daniel, I want to take a step back because I think it's actually, well, one, for those in the room who are new to you and your thinking, I would be remiss without exposing everyone to the extraordinary eloquence with which you articulate the state of civilization and how we got here. But I also think it's really incredible to have context in why you honed in on this particular problem as the most critical leverage point for humanity right now. And then we'll dive into, of that leverage point, why this particular intervention and how this intervention fits into like a broader theory of change. So we'll spend most of our time talking about the Consilience Project, but I did want to start off by taking this broader lens of what really is ultimately about the novelty of the problem landscape and the inadequacy of the problem-solving capability. So I wanted to take just a little bit of time and start with talking about that.
Yeah, thank you for the intro, and nice to be here, and nice to be connected to the people that are here. I don't think this needs belabored because I imagine everybody here is pretty aware that the kind of problem landscape that the world faces today is pretty distinct from what it faces at the time that the people who were developing theory of markets in the Scottish Enlightenment were coming up with their idea of markets, or when the founding fathers were coming up with the idea of American democracy, or really any previous time in history. And there are some ways in which the problems are similar and just kind of more in scale, but there are times where more in scale crosses a threshold and it actually becomes different in kind. And I believe that the problem landscape we face today is different in kind in some pretty fundamental ways from problems that we have needed to navigate in the past. such that our problem-solving processes are inadequate. So rather than say like the problem is climate change, or the problem is systemic racism, or the problem is, the great game of power in US-China relations, or AI, or whatever, if we step back and say, well, how well have we done with those types of problems over the last few decades? And does it seem like the combination of our business solutions and our government solutions and our nonprofit solutions and the various types of solutions we have are converging towards adequacy? Or does it seem like we're actually getting more catastrophic risks, higher probabilities of them? The latter is the way I mostly assess this. And we can see that, the Sustainable Development Goals haven't occurred with the UN IGO kind of landscape that was the most advanced governance system after World War II, when we realized that nation-state governments alone weren't enough to prevent world war, and now the scope of technology was such that we couldn't have major empires war anymore. Obviously, we haven't been able to succeed at nuclear deproliferation. We went from 2 countries with nukes to more countries with more and faster nukes. But also, every time a new technology came about, an arms race around it started. There's been an arms race around drones, around AI weapons, around cyber attacks, around biotech. And so clearly our governance systems cannot stop arms races effectively. They can't reverse existing ones. All of those increase the fragility of the world. And the other kind of thing like an arms race is a kind of race to the bottom, where if any actor does something that provides near-term game theoretic advantage, all the other actors kind of have to race to do it first, otherwise they lose by default. But with everybody racing to do that near-term advantageous thing first, it creates the worst situation globally for the long term. It's a very tricky kind of coordination problem. And the other race to the bottom is the tragedy of the commons type things, which is why we don't just have climate change as an environmental issue. We have planetary boundaries across most of the planetary boundaries becoming a critical factor, from species extinction to dead zones to overfishing of the oceans to on and on. And so for me, I step back and say, okay, I don't think that we can take another step and say, we have this idea in the West of an open society, whether it's a democracy or a republic or something where there is some concept of the people not being ruled by some small top-down force, but participating in their own governance. And we particularly like that because of the dignity of the individual and liberty and non-tyranny. And then we can see that, there are some really interesting situations in which, for instance, China has been able to develop high-speed rail, not just throughout the country, but has an almost monopoly on export of high-speed rail throughout the world. And the US still has not created a single high-speed rail, even within its own country. And this is a decades since that tech was invented situation. And we can see a lot of other things like that, where if there's a country that can institute a more autocratic process and doesn't have term limits, the lack of term limits means they can do long-term planning and long-term thinking. And the lack of internal left fighting right, and most of the energy getting just dissipated as heat and entropy, means that they can actually coordinate more effectively. So not only are the global problem-solving mechanisms inadequate, but the ones that we feel particularly ethically attached to are particularly decaying. So, Jenny, it sounds like you've got a thought.
Oh, no, I was just concurring.
Yeah. So the gist of what I'm paying attention to is
Well, I think
that
this, oh, sorry, I actually would say, I think this point is particularly fascinating about that open society leading to infighting versus solving the actual problems at hand.
well, if you think about what an open society is, you think about like what a democracy or a republic at a nation state level is, it's actually a kind of wild proposition to imagine that it could work at all. Because what we're saying is we're going to have a humongous number of people, and especially in a situation like the US where there isn't a lot of shared culture, history, ethnicity, but it's a humongous number of people across a huge geographic space from different cultures and different life experiences who believe different things and want different things. And the idea that all those people can figure out how to make choices together, can sublimate violence and figure out how to make choices together, is actually a wild proposition. the idea that most of human history was tribal, like really almost all of human history was tribal, and there was this hard upper limit to the size of tribes, and that programmed in us pretty deeply evolutionarily was this kind of tribal type dynamic where at the Dunbar scale, I could have a say in every major decision. It was a small enough situation that I knew every person intimately, and everyone could be part of a single conversation like this room. Beyond the Dunbar scale, I'm going to be subjected to some laws that I have no say in, possibly, and so the tribes would just cleave and stay smaller. And so then when we needed things larger than tribes, because tribal warfare started to create an advantage for larger groups, then we got a lack of open society. Like those early societies were what you could call an early form of open society or more consensus society. But then the idea that you have a king or a nobility class or an aristocracy or some small group that rules, that small group is basically like a tribe again. It's a relatively small number of people to coordinate together. And then everyone else is carrying things out. The idea that a humongous number of people can all coordinate together is actually a wild proposition. And in the Greek city-states, they were not humongous numbers of people. They were very small numbers of people. So the idea of a modern democracy, again, even at the time of the founding fathers, it was a tiny number of people where the foundational idea was everybody could get in a town hall and talk. So we weren't voting on a proposition that some special interest group created, and we weren't voting on a representative who would vote on propositions. We got to help craft the proposition through an open conversation where everybody could hear everybody's perspective. And that sense of scale was bound to the idea of it being possible, and that was following modernity and the kind of proliferation of both the philosophy of science and the Hegelian dialectic, that we could all come to understand reality similarly through the application of similar epistemic processes, and we could all come to understand each other's position through a Hegelian dialectical process where I could actively take their position, try to make their point, they could do the same. Then we could figure out a way where we could coordinate so as to sublimate warfare. And so the epistemic commons that we've talked about is this idea of if we have a huge number of people and we want order, but we want the order to not be imposed, it has to be emergent. How do you get, so you either get imposed order historically, autocracy of some kind, or you don't get order that's imposed and you don't get it at all and you get chaos. And to have something that isn't chaos or oppression has to be order that's emergent. To be emergent, the people have to be able to make sense of the world similarly, to come to understand what each other value and care about, and to be able to generate problem solution sets that are adequate. And so this is why we say there are cultural prerequisites to an open society being able to work. And we have seen the institutions that are supposed to help those prerequisites, education and the Fourth Estate in particular, have undergone major erosion and capture while the world has been complexifying. So the things that we have to engage in governance about actually take more capacity to understand. And so to have any chance of something like effective problem solving for the current problem landscape in the current world situation, and to have it be commensurate with an open society at all, we will need new problem solving capacities, new institutions that are adequate to the problems, which means we have to understand the problems well enough that we can think about how to do that. And it has to arise from the people understanding it, wanting it, and being able to take responsibility for it. Otherwise, if it comes from some small number of people and is instituted by force, it'll be oppressive.
Sure. And let's just touch on, we remiss without just in quickly summarizing where we're at, just how extraordinarily profound the role of the internet and social media has been in our ability to sense make.
Yeah, this is one of the places where there is a change in the nature of the situation we face, both the problems and the possibilities, that is a change in kind. Because we had a movement from a broadcast style type media, kind of starting with the printing press and then moving into larger printing press, meaning that, and again, this country was founded on the idea that and must. The Fourth Estate and education were both prerequisites to democracy functioning. But what that meant was that there was a capacity to understand what was going on and have that be shared with everyone. So some shared basis of talk about. And so then that moved from broadcast via print to radio to television. and started to fragment with more channels, and the channels appeal to different, political biases and like that. But then with the internet, you get not just more channels, you get something that isn't broadcast at all. You get this, rather than one to many, a many to many style communication, decentralized communication, which is why books like The Sovereign Individual, way back in the early days of the internet, said, oh, the digital age will actually end nation states because the people won't be their geographic proximity is going to bind them to each other less than their network proximity. And so people are going to be more connected to people in geographically dispersed areas outside of their country, less connected to their own country, and their fealty relationships are going to be more powerful. Network dynamics are going to make it to where you have, Google's and Facebook's having more people than China and the US combined. And the ability to share information and coordinate. So that new change to the techno-industrial base is going to change the social systems, but they were hoping that it would be a kind of a libertarian rising because of the democratization of the ability for everybody to share information. But of course, what ended up happening was when everybody can share information, you get an information overwhelmed flood, and there's a billion search results for anything. So nobody will ever see them all. So there isn't the possibility for rational actors, even if that thing existed, which it mostly doesn't, for rational actors to select the best information and have it come to the top. Instead, you have some AI that's going to be able to search everything and determine what you see through what shows up in the recommended videos or the news feed. And so what you end up getting is a concentration of power, radically more than even the broadcast had in the past, and a concentration of power that, based on those companies that do that are financial agents, and based on their own agentic motives, how they fund themselves, end up curating the information space of people's attention in ways that are fundamentally incommensurable with a shared sense of reality.
And then I feel like that power concentration, I mean, generally a attribute of the current system of asymmetric power is so important. Maybe I'll just have you say a little bit about that, and then we'll transition into consilience.
Do you want to say one more thing of what you have in mind on asymmetric power? Because there's a lot we could say about that.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that this, I mean, maybe I'm taking us a little bit too tangential in it, because you just mentioned the concentration of power within the information ecology with the intermediaries, given the volume of information, right? But you also say concentration of power in the economic systems. You see concentration of
Yeah.
power. So that feature of the current institutional infrastructure is part of what makes it self-terminating, but that may be getting a little bit too into the weeds.
It's worth speaking to briefly is, again, go back to the time and the writing in the Scottish Enlightenment of thinking about theory of markets. Obviously, a lot has changed. When the ideas were being developed through von Mises and Hayek and towards Rand of Homo economicus, and the idea of a rational actor where people would want real products and services that would enrich the quality of their life, and they want them at the best value. So the demand creates an evolutionary niche for supply, and the rational actor will choose the best product or service at the best price, which creates a selective pressure for healthy innovation and resource distribution. That idea, we've seen through the whole field of behavioral economics that that thing is mostly not true, that Homo economicus, the rational actor, people aren't getting exposed to all of the feature sets in an equal way. There's a tremendous amount of status making bias that can hijack people's decision making, and where there's more incentive to invest in marketing than product, and that kind of stuff. We've seen that. So there's many places where we can say that underlying thinking about markets has shifted, but one of them is the scale of asymmetry. The largest corporations at the time of that thinking, and even at the time of the founding of the US, were tiny in comparison to the size of corporations today, but individuals are still individuals. And so the total asymmetry of power between individual interests and corporate interests has moved to a place where, to the degree that there is a agentic difference, they have a game theoretic relationship with each other, it's an asymmetric war that really can't be addressed in the same way. So the idea, even at the size that corporations or kind of financial wealth consolidation was at the founding of this country, the founding of this country had the idea that we'll do this thing called liberal democracy, where we we'll have a market. We won't try to have a state-planned economy. We'll have a market because we think markets are actually good systems of collective sense-making and choice-making. People will determine what they want and value. They'll determine who does a good job of it. That's the sense-making part. And it'll get upregulated, and it'll do a good job of resource allocation and production and incentive. But we don't have a pure laissez-faire economy. We do have a state because people want to hire someone to kill people for them or sex traffic or all kinds of things. So we want there are certain things that we don't want markets for, that markets would otherwise grow up for. We want to keep some national parks where all the trees don't get cut down, even if there's profit incentive to do so. So we're going to make a thing called rule of law. And the other key insight was, it was known even then, that if I start out a population, if I could start out a population at t equals 0, where everyone had the exact same amount of money, and then hit go in a market type dynamic, a power law distribution of the ownership of wealth would eventually emerge. In almost every scenario, again and again, some people will do better at making money than others, and then the more money they have will make it, you gain interest on interest compoundingly. The same thing happens with debt, plus access to other financial services and things like that. And so you end up getting this power law distribution. So how do the few who have a lot of wealth not have their interests end up being oppressive to everybody else? And then you get feudalism again, which was the thing we were trying to get out of. Well, you can't just trust those who have the wealth to care for the view of the many and the common. So we're going to make this thing called a state that is going to represent the will of the collective people. And the state has to have even more power than the most powerful economic interests have. And so that's the idea, that it has a thing called a monopoly of violence that can, through the police force, mostly internally, military externally, so it can institute rule of law. But the rule of law in a government of, for, and by the people who are voting on the law is to represent the collective will or ethics of the people. So the values of the people are the basis of jurisprudence, get codified in law, and you have this protective watchdog who is to basically allow markets to do the good thing they do, but where there is a unhealthy market incentive, somebody wants to rob a bank as a market incentive in the broadest definition of it, where there is a predatory market incentive, the rule of law is going to bind it. Well, we can see now, with the difficulty in realizing that Facebook and YouTube and like that have splintered the information commons so profoundly, and the cultural cohesion so profoundly, that it's undermining the capacity for democracy, undermining any sense of like patriotic solidarity. And so you get so much infighting, which means you can't coordinate relative to an autocracy that doesn't have that, which means the 21st century gets lost to technologically empowered autocracy, because the technology is being used to fragment rather than create order in the open society, and it's being used to create more order in the closed society. So we can see already that those companies have a scale that has more coordination power. We're talking about asymmetry. Then the government has coordination power to be able to effectively regulate. This is one of the issues where we say we need different problem-solving institutions and capacities. Again, is we're used to regulating some market thing after the harm of it is very well known and established. So many people have died of DDT or died of Vioxx or cigarettes that in some extraordinarily slow process we regulate after the fact. With exponential tech and autopoietic tech that goes very fast, and once it's going, can't really stop. If you try to regulate that way, it'll just not work. And, Elon made that point with regard to AI. By the time you see the harm that has come, it's too late. And yet we don't have processes in place to be able to do anticipatory law. And even if we did, we don't have the kind of institutional integrity and transparency that the people would actually want the institutions to have that much power. So this is why we need institutions that are trusted, because they're actually trustworthy, which means they have to be checked by the people, which means you need a cultural kind of renaissance of people that can make sense of the issues that we're governing on to give rise to new,
now we're
adequately capable institutions.
That's right. Now we're back to the prerequisite for democracy to function and the demise of the education and the fourth estate, which brings us to the Consilience Project.
Yes.
So I it was a little bit more time than I wanted to spend on this, but I think it's a fascinating case study of the complexity of the problem and the need to have this very wide lens. But then how do you actually identify an intervention that a group of people can enact, right? And so we'll talk about that intervention, and then I think then we'll widen the lens again and talk about, well, how does that intervention fit into like a broader movement, and what are the spillovers, and what does that look like? So you talk about the aim is to facilitate a cultural renaissance, developing the full human capabilities and orientations needed for effective and emergent governance adequate to the novelty and scope of the current problems and the catastrophic risks that we collectively face. I found it interesting that you described it as the aim of the project is to help catalyze a cultural enlightenment that will develop a new set of shared values and capacities. When I look at what Consilience is doing, I see it so much as developing the capabilities, the sense-making capabilities, right? Both in terms of what that process looks like, but also the information itself. But I find it curious that you frame it as a cultural enlightenment, and this may be just a way that I think about what I say when I say culture. And so I'd love to just double click on why that's the frame that you have for this.
Yeah. What do you think of when you think of culture?
I think of values and beliefs and narratives and worldviews, less around problem-solving capacities.
Yeah. I don't think you can separate problem-solving capacities from values or beliefs from the process by which we come to believe things. And so if we're solving a problem, we're solving it in service of something we value. That's kind of the key.
Yeah, I mean, that was my next question, since you're integrating your response, was I also found it interesting that values are coming up, unless there's sort of a fundamental value around truth-seeking.
You won't invest in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if we just thought it's about sense-making, like, okay, if some people think climate change isn't a real thing at all, and some people think that it's a real thing but we have time to solve it, and some people think that it's a real thing and it's too late, their different assessments of the world lead to them thinking different solutions are totally insane or totally necessary. And so there is no way to be able to coordinate a choice with people who have a completely different sense of what base reality is. So this is why we need coordination of sense making. We call this epistemic commons. I will make a distinction real quick of why I use the term epistemic commons rather than knowledge or information commons. A knowledge commons, which, you can see things like Wikipedia and kind of open digital movements trying to make a knowledge commons. Can the things that we accept as the facts of reality that go through some process to determine if it's a fact or not, or what that means, that it is a trustworthy thing, that's openly available. Well, that's necessary but not sufficient for a number of reasons. How do we decide that this was an appropriate process and this thing is a fact, or what the confidence margin on this truth is, or if these are facts that were on one side of a distribution of things we could look at, so they're true but they're not representative. And so that's an epistemic process to say, how do we know that our knowledge is knowledge, and how do we know that our knowledge is relevant to the choices that we have to make? And let's say I have access to a lot of data, but it's more data than I can possibly process. I don't just need access to the knowledge, I need access to the knowledge processing capacity. Some of that is computational, but some of it is also just the epistemological, the capacity to understand. And ultimately, if I've got a bunch of data and we all agree that it's true and representative, we still have to be able to say, how do we make sense of that in a way that's going to inform a solution that we're going to agree on? Ultimately, with governance, what we're trying to do is coordinate choice making. How do a lot of people make choices that interaffect each other, where we make agreements about choices that end up working for everybody? And so the sense making is upstream from the choice making. So this is why we don't talk about the information commons as adequate. We talk about the epistemic commons. What is the shared process by which we come to understand the world together? Now, if I still want a totally different world than you do, and maybe a world that I think is mutually exclusive with yours, our values commons isn't in place. So even if we both agree that X is true, but I think X is good and you think X is bad, that's not a third person epistemology, philosophy of science, data kind of
Right.
process. That's a first and second person values kind of process. So if what we're really trying to do is coordination, which means shared choice making, upstream from our choice making is our sense making and our
Yep.
meaning making or values generation. What do we think is happening in the world is choice making? What do we think the effect of a particular action will be on that? Forecasting is part of sense making. But then what is it that we care about that we're trying to make a choice in service of? Now, we don't just have to share sense making so we can have a shared sense of the world. We also have to care about what other people care about, to be able to say, how do we identify what are all of the values that are seeking to be served here? Because oftentimes the main reason we can't move forward with something isn't a breakdown in sense making. Sometimes the breakdown in sense making is secondary to a breakdown in shared values. So I know a lot of people who don't believe in climate change, and they've never looked at the science. They don't care that the reason that they don't believe in it is because the people who believe in it are proposing solutions that they believe harm something that they care about more. So they think that there's a carbon tax that is going to be instituted on the whatever countries agree, and it's only going to be Western countries. It's going to lower the GDP of those countries. China's not going to implement it, and they see that there is a great game of geopolitical power for control of the 21st century between societies that at least care a little bit about open society versus full technologically empowered autocracy. And they're like, your carbon credit solution, the way you currently have it proposed, in trying to decrease carbon in a way that will still not be sufficient, cedes the 21st century to technologically empowered autocracy. So they can't even come to focus on the sense making because there's a different problem that they
Sure.
feel more connected to.
Sure.
And so this is why I say we don't understand the problems well, is because the problem isn't climate change and the problem isn't US-China relations. The problem isn't the relationship between carbon and GDP or the energy return on energy investment time of moving to a new energy economy. The problem is how those problems relate. If I don't understand how they relate, and this is why we get to that the underlying problem is that our problem solving capacities are inadequate.
And
We have problems.
And a really
Go
critical
ahead.
point here that we did make earlier that I just want to make sure is that so many of our problems are a consequence of the externalities associated with solutions to the prior problems that we
Yes.
solved. This wrong scoping of the problem is such a critical piece of the puzzle.
And so let's say we go back to the issue that you brought up earlier of, are there kind of infotech and social media technologies that were trying to solve a problem that have had externalities that weren't intended? So what problem would Facebook say that it was trying to solve early on? Well, it was like giving social connectivity to people. Now, it made all the sense in the world to do the basic things they did. Let's try to make it useful to as many users as possible, so we'll make it free. In order to be able to pay for that, we've got to have an ad model.
Yeah.
And we're going to give social connectivity. Well, now the ad model is going to create
It's a great
the
example.
need to optimize for time on site, to optimize for ad revenue. And it turns out that when you don't try to figure it out theoretically, you actually are empirical and you do the split testing. The thing that optimizes people's time on site actually makes them more tribal rather than less tribal. It appeals to their biases and limbic hijack. So the second order effect is increased extremism of all kinds on almost every issue.
Yep.
And epistemic nihilism and overwhelm.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great example. I'm gonna take that one with me. But just help me understand values. For example, I think a lot about how capitalism and its insatiable quest for growth has led to a corruption of our values, right? Or things like the extent to which we value status, which I think has something to do with human psychology. So when I think about those as values, I think about paradigm shifts, like from scarcity to abundance, from me to we, the narratives around the self, from independent to interconnected. I think of those around the values, but it's still not clear to me how Consilience is addressing that. Maybe I'm just thinking about values differently.
So let's say we talk about me to we. There's another step, which is small we to larger we, right? We can have a ethnocentric set of values or, some kind of tribal set of values that is highly partisan. Like we feel very identified with blue democratic left ideals and we want to win over the, crazy people on the right or with our particular race or religion or whatever it is. So there is actually a sense of we, but it is a kind of
Little we.
tribal we
Yeah.
that is in a rivalrous relationship with larger we. And because in inhabiting that particular worldview, particularly in this time where there is the incentive in the entire information landscape to drive extremism and limbic hijack, it feels right and righteous to engage in culture wars because the other guys are so wrong and so bad, and your situation is so right and so dire, and they're bad faith actors, that engaging in whatever kind of method that you need to be able to create the win is the only appropriate thing to do. And so we've seen places where the parties have damaged the solidarity of the country for a party win. Now, what you get is 4 years. If you win, you get 4 years where you don't have enough time because that person needs to get reelected in 4 years or your party needs to win again. You're not going to build high-speed trains that take 30 years. You're actually not going to do anything that takes more than about 2 years because you need to show return on that to get elected again.
Yep.
So you'll never have long-term planning. You'll actually try to spend a chunk of the time to appeal to your support base by undoing whatever the other side did in the last 4 years, knowing they're going to undo your shit in 4 or 8 years. And all of the kind of energy just goes into heat, and the other party that you beat doesn't stop existing because you won. And they don't feel better about things, they feel worse, and they don't stop being political actors, and they learn whatever technologies you employed to get that win, and they iterate on them and upregulate them and come back stronger. So you drive arms races and culture wars.
Yep, that's interesting.
And there's a point that I really want people to understand is war is it's a pretty fundamental part of the human story. When we're studying history, we're largely studying histories of wars. World War II was a unique situation. Up until World War II, major empires always fought. There was no time where there was a long period of time where the major empires weren't fighting. World War II was the first time where our weapons got so big that if the major empires ever fought, everyone would lose. You couldn't win anymore. That was a fundamental bright line in the sand change point where, and this is why we say that win-lose games eventually become lose-lose games because the scope of harm becomes larger than the playing field can handle. And the scope of harm either by the direct harm in a war or the indirect harm in externality. You can't run exponential war, you can't run exponential externality on a finite planet. So with World War II, we had to make a world after that where the major superpowers wouldn't war. We would proxy war, we would unconventional war, but we couldn't kinetic war. So mutually assured destruction was the only way we survived from World War II on. And then to be able to say, okay, well, mutually assured destruction, so we're not going to use our kinetic weapons, but also we have to then relate to each other some other way. So let's create a bunch of international agreements and economic interdependence, so it's more economically advantageous to run globalism than it is to war with each other. Well, what we get to see is that when the kinetic weapon became large enough, the logic of war broke. Something that I would say is that kinetic war is only one type of war. It's a rivalrous win-lose type dynamic. There's political war, there's economic warfare, there's diplomatic warfare, there's information and narrative and mimetic warfare. Yep. With the exponential tools we have in the narrative landscape and the information landscape, the ability to be able to have someone's newsfeed just show images that hit their deepest wounds and bias, causing massive vicarious trauma and kind of what seems like an overwhelm of supportive information that creates a sense of both certainty and outrage that is exactly opposed to some other group's certainty and outrage. These are the equivalent of nukes in the information space, in the epistemic commons space, and if you keep trying to win culture wars with them, you get a similar effect to an actual nuclear war. It's as you get a comprehensive lose-lose scenario where you end up getting a fragmented war of all against all and a destruction of the epistemic commons where nobody actually has an idea what is true anymore. And those bad faith interactions that we have with the out-group become what we're most trained in, so they end up happening in subtle ways even within our in-group, and we get fractal defection. So culture war is short-sighted. It doesn't recognize that, like the multipolar traps of other kinds, that in pursuing what seems like necessary short-term win, but that has myopia in it, it's actually foreclosing on the chance for its own goals long term.
Mm-hmm.
It's creating a world in which its own goals become impossible.
Yep. All right. Well, let's double click on consilience. I want to talk in a little bit more detail about what is it, and then we'll get into the type of contents and their objectives and how they interrelate. Tell us about the
Yes.
Consilience Project. You just launched the alpha last month to a few of us, and then you've just launched the beta in the last week.
I have this challenge of that the thing that we are endeavoring to do doesn't fit into a easy class of, it's not doing a journalism project or a traditional education or a kind of political movement, because as we said, we think the problem solving processes are inadequate. So it's kind of a different class of things. So it takes me a little bit more to describe.
Yep.
Fundamentally, there's a relationship between three things that we're trying to elucidate and make clear to a larger group of people that can use that information and coordinate in a number of ways. The three things are helping people understand the actual nature and novelty of the problem landscape the world currently faces. As we were mentioning earlier, climate change isn't a problem. It's the relationship between, which is why the attempts to solve climate change keep either not working and driving polarization and like that, or if it works, it can work and externalize harm to another area. But mostly because someone sees the area it'll be externalized to, they oppose it. It's the relationship of climate change to the relationship between violence and GDP and US-China relations and on and on. You have to be able to think about what is both generating the problem and how do the problems interconnect to come up with solutions to truly global scale things that don't continue to polarize half of the population against your solution, which means you have to do shared sense making and values generation to be able to come up with solutions that can actually be points of real coordination. So we're wanting people to understand the unique problem landscape that we face now and how it is fundamentally different than what Marx looked at, what the founding fathers looked at, what the development of any previous social system was even trying to deal with. And then we want to be able to show how the previous social systems, whether we're talking about socialism or markets or liberal democracy, what types of problems they were trying to solve, where those are successful and relevant and we need to factor them, but where they still on their own catastrophically fail in this current problem landscape, to show the need for fundamental innovation in social technology. Not physical technology applied to, but fundamentally innovation in social technology. So that's the second step. So the first step is the unique situation we're in now, unique problem landscape. Second is that we need new problem solving capacities and institutions. Third is, where do those come from? If they come from anything other than the will of the people, both asking for them and taking responsibility to participate with them, then they will be oppressive. And that's why we say cultural renaissance. Ultimately, it has to be the people's shared values and shared understanding giving rise to the change in social technology for it to be commensurate with an open society and kind of liberty at the level of individuals that's also is commensurate with harmony at the level of groups.
Right.
And so that's the thing we're trying to elucidate. So we have basically two arms of focus. Now I'll talk practically. That's kind of like the topics. Practically, there's a publishing focus and a movement building focus. The publishing focus is the thing we're focused on first because it's kind of laying out foundational concepts that we can do movement building around. And so in our publishing focus, we're developing a thing called the Consilience Papers. And a lot like how the writings in the Scottish Enlightenment that were kind of philosophical about social theory gave rise to modern capitalism, or the Federalist Papers and the writings of the Founding Fathers gave rise to and kind of reified constitution as a system of government, or throughout history that's happened. We're looking at what are the new systems of governance and coordination, and people are experimenting in blockchain, and countries like Taiwan and Estonia are looking at countrywide experiments. And what are the new coordination capacities, the new social technologies? What are some of the necessary criteria that they must have in place to be adequate to the problem landscape? Enough people have to understand that they can be doing prototyping and innovation that is well informed. And then we want to see lots of prototypes and innovations in the future of journalism, the future of education, the future of economics, all of the major institutions. So we're writing this series of papers, and there's three
So
major types of papers.
one question for you, because one of the questions as I'm looking at this is about also process, and you just mentioned a really crucial component of process around just this embracing of prototyping and experimentation and iteration for defining what the new system looks like. How does that? I mean, it's a very significant shift in mindset from the dominant way we think about problem solving of just sitting around a table and finding the answer and then going and implement that answer. How does that problem-solving paradigm shift fit into Consilience?
Well, it's fundamentally the heart of it. And like we said earlier, almost all of human history, it was tribal. Depending upon which model of early human origins, we're looking at 200,000 or 300,000 or more years of almost all just never more than about 150 people together. And then this thing of larger numbers of people being very, very recent and beset with environmental difficulties and war and subjugation and stuff kind of throughout. And so there were problem solving processes in that place where it, based on the scale, everyone could participate in coming up with a solution, so everybody could feel at least relatively informed by and good about, and they could feel a certain fealty to each other and interconnectedness with each other, so that, and they could all sense the same base reality. And so there was something about the problem solving process that was the majority of human history that was very scale dependent. And then we can see clear reasons in history why that thing couldn't continue. But the other thing that took off wasn't because it was comprehensively better at problem solving. It solved the problem of effective warfare better. It made it through famines and wars better, but while actually destroying environments faster and subjugating and killing people faster in many ways too. So, and as we know about evolution, that evolution can be kind of blind and select for things that are advantageous now that actually make more likelihood for extinction in the future because of fragility. We see a similar thing here, where what has won that has made it through wars of various kinds with exponential tech applying the same principles self-terminates. And that's, I think, the kind of key insight, is that what has been selected for was game theoretic dominance at the level of group. Game theoretic dominance at the level of group, we would argue, self-terminates in the verticalizing part of exponential tech. So we actually need something beyond that. So there's like tribal, which was scale dependent. Then there was like empire up until now, which is not scale dependent in the same way, but has these massive externalities. Then there is there something that can operate at the scales that we need to operate, that can also be a safe vessel for the amount of power we have, that can be not massively externality driving? And a way of thinking about that is technology extends the power of our choices. Exponential technology means exponentially more powerful choices. What does it take to have humanity be a safe vessel for the power of exponential technology, where we neither utilize it in intentionally harmful or unintentionally harmful ways? To not even use it in unintentionally harmful ways, like the Facebook example, and a million other examples we can give like that, requires not just values, but also the kind of thoughtfulness and wisdom and problem solving process to not just define problems in a narrow way, a win for our group or a win for some metric like, CO2 or GDP or whatever it is, that can externalize harm to other metrics that also matter. So there has to be as there's an increase in the scope of effect in systems that are intrinsically interconnected, there has to be an increase in the capacity to process those interconnections and internalize those externalities to the problem definition itself.
Yep. Well, let's talk about the three different variants of the publishing component.
Yes. So basically, three types of papers that interlink. There's kind of theoretical papers, we're calling them the Foundation series. Situational assessments about current situations in the world and this meta news thing. The foundational papers are addressing some of the stuff we're talking about today, like what was the basis of the Dunbar number or kind of scale limitations, and then how different social technologies operate at different scales, and where we look at things like the binding energy of a group relative to the cleaving energy of a group and different systems of coordination. And what we're really doing with the Foundation series is helping to understand principles of human social coordination, the various types that have occurred, the way that changes in our technology and the techno-industrial base have always created different types of behaviors and world dynamics that ended up mandating new types of social technology. And then an awareness of how the new physical tech that both exists and is emerging now is both obsoleting the adequacy of our previous social technology and then foreshadowing what does the adequate future social technology look like. So I'll give you an example in one vertical. Let's say we take education. We have a series of pieces on education. There will be a similar one on the fourth estate and economics. But on education, fundamentally, we want to start with what is education? Like, what is the role of education in the most fundamental sense to any civilization from a tribe on? Well, it has to do with the intergenerational knowledge transfer of the entire knowledge set needed to run the civilization, plus the capacity development to develop the new capacities that will be needed moving forward. So maintain the old relevant ones, develop new ones. And so we can think of it as kind of social autopoiesis. And obviously, when you have a change in the technological base, so now we have an industrial revolution, people need to learn how to do new things that they didn't need to know how to do before. Now they need to learn machinery and how to, operate industrial capacities and those types of things. And so there's just kind of more principled fundamental understanding of what a necessary education system must be, which is the development of the humans and everything that they need, from civics to law to all the aspects of manufacturing and industry and et cetera, to be able to mediate the civilization moving forward. Then we have to explain how an open society has a higher educational demand than a closed society. Because if I have a monarch or a nobility that is making the major decisions, then people need educated how to do their labor function, how to do their specific kind of market function, but they don't need educated on how to make the major decisions of the society. But if we have this idea that rather than a few people, where you can have some cognitive elite that just learns that stuff, who are focused on making the decisions, if everyone is going to participate in the decision making, so you have something like governance of, for, and by the people, then the people need educated not only for their position they're going to have in kind of the market and labor, but also the position they're going to have for civic duty, that they can understand the issues upon which we need to govern well enough that they can actually meaningfully engage.
Yeah, I mean,
Way
yeah.
higher.
I
Go ahead.
see the foundational series is really essential for understanding human society. I mean, it very much is the conversation that we're having at Dent, right? How did we
Yeah.
get here? and how do we use that understanding to inform a social redesign? Right. And this is something that you
Yeah.
have explored, incredible, beautiful detail for decades. So it's an extraordinary contribution to humanity to have that laid out. And I know there's a tremendous amount. I mean, what I also think, well, let's talk about the three types, because it's just really beautiful how you how you describe the guidelines for the team. And I think this is so fascinating, right? How the team presents information and does it in a way that is modeling sense making, how it protects against its own bias, how recognize how the way that it's presented might reflect how the information is received. I think that that's also fascinating, but I want to talk about that. So there's the foundational piece, and then there's two more. So let's talk about those.
Yeah. I appreciate you moving us along. If you don't mind, I want to just leave a last part on that education thing, because
Yeah,
it
of
will give
course,
an
of course.
example of how, for a single kind of institutional capacity, it closes. Because that part was largely theoretical and historical. There's one more historical part of then overviewing how the decay of education in the US and the West in general has happened over the last several decades. But then the key part, what is all that culminating to, is a vision for the future of education that says if this is what education is fundamentally has to do, necessary for it to do, for civilization to work and for it to be an open civilization, these things, well then in a post-digital age and an information singularity age and an age with technological and AI automation, what the fuck is the role of education? What would it look like in that world when you don't have to educate humans to do things that you can program robots to do? And you can't educate humans to be subject matter experts when there's more information than any human can learn in a subject after information singularity in the way you used to be able to, but you can have AIs do it. Now you have a very deep existential question of, in that world, what is the role of humans? And what do we want it to be? How do we want to steer? What is fundamentally meaningful about human life? And what are humans also uniquely good at relative to automation? Where then there is a symbiotic intelligence between what gets programmed in machinery and what gets developed in the humans. This now gets to core, this is why the values come up, core existential questions that are going to guide the future. And if we don't consciously do it, then whatever way the market happens to steer exponential tech accidentally does it. And almost all of those attractors are dystopic. So being able to point to what could the future of education look like there, and this both shows a way through the dystopic things that can occur with an information singularity and technological automation and unemployment and whatever, and shows it can go particularly terrible ways. Is there any good way that it could go? Is there a protopic attractor? And if so, what does that world look like? And what does the restructure of our social technology look like? So I just wanted to close that because I think
Yeah, of course.
that's the in that's what we're actually trying to converge towards, and it's so that more people can be engaged in these conversations and actually the participation in critiquing the ideas, making the ideas better, expanding on them, and prototyping them.
Yep.
So that's the foundation series. That is the core of the thing we're trying to do. The situational assessments are where we take the social theory that we're laying out there and assess current situations in the world that we need to govern on, that are important, critical things, but where we're assessing them not just through the normal kind of geopolitical, economic lenses that foreign affairs or the diplomat or the economist would, but where if we're looking at US-China relationships, we'll be applying the concept of multipolar traps and race to the bottom scenarios to be able to look at the fundamental coordination challenges to say, what would it take to actually shift this? Or being able to apply models of institutional decay to say, if this was actually still the government of the 40s or 50s, we would have built high-speed trains. What happened? So there's a bunch of social theory that makes the world make more sense than the current models through which it's being perceived. And this both makes the social theory get reified and people can understand it. It also can give people insights into the current world landscape that can bring about more effective problem solving. So that's the situational assessments as an application of those principles of kind of how to think about society to how to think about the current world problems.
Yeah, and I love the interconnection between the foundation and the situational assessment, insofar as the situational assessments are really modeling that sense making.
Right. And then also feeding back into it with the way the specific details can give clarification. And then wherever we're going to do a situational assessment on a world topic where people's opinions are already fraught, where there's highly polarized perception, then either what we're going to do is going to sound like just a new one of the chems in the narrative landscape. So if we're doing a topic like COVID viral origins or climate change or anything like that, where the existing landscape is already highly polarized, then in addition to just doing the situational assessment, we have to also say, what are the various kind of primary trending narratives that already exist that people are camped out in having culture wars around? And how did they come to be? What are the partially true things they're looking at? What are the values they're connected to? That's the steelmanning side. Where is there either kind of omission or some epistemic mistakes happening, or even vested interests driving narrative warfare and propaganda happening? And then after being able to survey the landscape of narratives, look at the forensics of how they emerged, both steelman them and do critical analysis, then we step back and say, what can we say about the space as a whole with high certainty, and what stuff should just live in uncertainty? The goal there, once you do several of those, is to hopefully, one, give people better, when they get to see how, oh, that looked like a fact and it made it through the fact checker, but it was cherry picked. So yes, it was a true fact, but the cherry picking and the decontextualization of the fact and then the kind of narrative framing or Lakoff framing on it made a conclusion that was somewhere between wrong and partial from things that all looked true in their parts. Now that I see that, I can look for it everywhere and be less susceptible. So it's creating like a mimetic immune system to inoculate against the propaganda and narrative warfare,
This is
while helping to train people on the epistemology to actually make sense after they have recovered their sense making from being hijacked.
this is such an essential piece of the puzzle, right? And that after you are able to see the meta news, you build up your own capacity to notice information and narrative warfare, and in a sense, inoculate yourself from it.
And because we said the problems need new institutions, the institutions have to emerge from the people, which means we have to have a culture of people that understand and care. We have to be able to have some people stop being pulled into the existing broken culture and culture wars, and be able to say, like, no, I actually don't want to be partisan. I don't want to be part of a camp that has partial views and have my bias confirmed. Like, I want to understand what is true as effectively as I can. And I want to understand what matters to everybody. There's a certain respect and dignity for all humans that I have, where I realize that whatever I do, I can't make them stop being actors in the world. So I'm stuck with them. And that they love their kids and they dream about things and they're afraid of things and they have feelings. And I want to understand well enough that I can help work towards solutions that could actually be viable for everybody. And that means we have to have people who stop getting captured by the existing culture war nonsense, so that they can then start seeking each other and developing a new culture that is oriented in this way.
Yep. And there's a really critical question about who is this built for?
In the most important sense, in the broadest, longest term sense, everybody, though that obviously isn't the initial answer. The initial answer is, especially with the foundations work, we're trying to do like what is fundamentally knowledge work at the edge of social theory, to be able to not just give deeper and better understanding of the nature of the problems, but also criteria for what it would take to solve them. So then we're looking for other people who want to think about and work on those issues and contribute to the thinking, and also people who want to implement and prototype. And so that could be anyone who's from people who are working in journalism, to who are working in education, to who are working on blockchain and decentralized autonomous organizations, to people who are working in government and want to make different applications there, whatever, anything like that. Now, those are the people who we think will be automatically drawn and see the relevance and be able to participate right away. But it is, for us to really be talking about a cultural enlightenment, it has to actually become decentralized, wide, and the zeitgeist of it represented in all of the subcultures. So we had someone who's working on a rap battle platform reach out to us,
I
and
love
we had
this
an
one.
interesting conversation
Yeah.
because they said, people are pissed off, and the rap battle allows people to express their kind of anger, emotional energy, and upset in a way that doesn't require violence and can kind of sublimate it. But to be good at it, you also have to have good command of language, which means that you have to think about topics better and have better words and better kind of verbal fluency, and you have to listen to what the other guy rapped about. So you have to listen well if you're going to rap battle well. So there's a way to be able to take people's passion, take their upset, sublimate it, and actually create an incentive for them to grow in their listening and thinking and communication skills. I'm like, fucking awesome. That's great. So then they were saying, could we get the best rap battlers that we're bringing there to learn some of the information that is more comprehensive and nuanced that you're bringing about on the topics they like to rap about, like
Yeah.
police violence and whatever,
Yeah.
where then people are impressed by that and say, how did you learn that stuff? And that creates an on-ramp. That wouldn't be for us to figure out. It would be for them to figure out and for us to help how we could.
Sure.
And there were similar groups that were saying, how do we do a uniquely Islamic enlightenment? How do we do a unique enlightenment to the culture of all of the different cultures? And it's not going to be ours to figure out. It's going to be ours to facilitate as best we can to the degree that there is interest. And so that's where the project has to be decentralized. And this is the movement building side. We're putting some information out. The movement building side is less engineered on our part and more supportive.
Well, I want to zoom out to the movement building piece in a minute, but I want to stay into the weeds a little bit on consilience because I think there's some more interesting pieces to talk about. What I find interesting about the rap battle example is that some people are more amenable to messages from different messengers. That decentralized nature, I think, is important for that. But there's such great care that the Consilience Project is putting into thinking about how to present the information in order to not cause a reflexive reaction, understand how people with different political or philosophical views might respond to the information, be very, very cautious about showing really what's under the hood, what you don't know. And I just love to speak a little bit more to that because having just an awareness around how things are presented and perceived in order to hold the position that Consilience aspires to is such an important part of it.
Yeah, this is a very sensitive thing, which is the moment that virtue starts being signaled intentionally for the benefit it provides rather than the signal be an almost unconscious and automatic byproduct of it being lived earnestly, it starts to destroy the basis of virtue everywhere because people can't tell which one is which, and then there's a nihilism that can occur. So there's a way of being diplomatic for strategic reasons, and people will learn this in rhetoric. A lawyer might be able to learn how to argue either side, but they don't actually seek to inhabit it. They're not necessarily feeling it or caring. It's actually a skill to be able to win arguments or to be able to avoid critique or something like that. That's not what we're seeking to do. Like we're writing a piece right now on what we would call good faith and bad faith argumentation. But there is a naive version of good faith argumentation that doesn't recognize that some people who feel and are oppressed by a system end up having understandably strong emotions about the nature of things and less patience and capacity for patience, and maybe even less access to the education that can do the good faith thing. So they're like, no, fuck, this good faith thing is a type of like gaslighting. But then you get culture wars that lead to lose-lose for everybody. So there has to be not the naive version, not the cynical version, but the post-cynical version. What does earnest good faith actually look like? And it looks like the worst kind of bad faith is performative good faith, where someone is speaking like they respect or they care, but they don't really. This is one of the things that I found most interesting in studying cluster B dynamics, that narcissism and sociopathy often have the trait that the people have higher than average cognitive empathy, while lower than average embodied empathy. Mm-hmm. And that means that they can model someone else's theory of mind well enough to sell you something or kind of manipulate you, but because of the cognitive empathy. But the embodied empathy means they don't actually care. And so yes, you can see our guiding principles of when we're writing things, that if we're taking a particular social theorist's idea on something, we both understand, and we're going to utilize it, we both want to study that social theorist, and we want to study the critiques of them, at minimum, if not the whole environment that they were emerging in response to. And we want to think about the various political camps and cultural camps that'll be reading this and how it will land for them. Not, though, from the strategic purpose of, how do we communicate without blemishes, but from the point of view of, if the solutions that we're working towards are not authentic solutions for everyone, they won't work. And so nothing less than actually, and if they don't factor the values and the truth that every perspective has, they will be missing critical stuff and they won't work. And so what we'd say is, in a radically interconnected world, whatever you think you don't care about is connected to what you think you do care about. And if you are even rationally clear enough, you'll recognize the things that you don't care about, you should. And so, yes, there's a lot of principles in our writing of how to be able to factor the various perspectives and be thoughtful about it. And that factoring advisors, or if we're taking advisor input on a topic, we're seeking far left and far right views. We're seeking, if we were going to do a topic on the India-China border or the Israel-Palestine border, we'd want to be seeking views on all sides of that and really seeking to understand them. Otherwise, what are we doing? We're not going to be able to offer anything that could possibly really help. But all of those practices arise from the actual belief that it's authentically important and necessary to understand where people are coming from and actually caring, as opposed to a performative basis. So I just had to underline that.
Is it possible to not have the work biased and
No,
influenced by worldview?
no.
You just do the
This
best
is,
that you can.
we don't say we're doing unbiased work. We're saying we're doing active bias correction.
Mm.
And so rather than try to say there is some objective point of view, this is like, Einstein made this clear with there is no non-inertial reference frame.
Yep.
What is the mass or the length? The most fundamental physical properties of a thing depends upon your relative inertial reference frame, and there is no absolute inertial reference frame.
Mm.
And then postmodernism kind of took some of the critiques further of there's more stuff in any given situation to pay attention to than you possibly can. There's 1,000 or 1,000,000,000,000 times more bits of information than you can pay attention to. So even if you do perfectly good objective science, which subset you chose to pay attention to has a bias built into it. And so rather than try to do the naive objectivist move that says no bias, instead we'll try to say, what seem like the various biases that are clustering together as camps, and how do we take all of them? How do we really try to inhabit as best we can, talk with the people that are there and inhabit as best we can, so that we can bias correct and say, oh, there's some signal here that's actually really key, that taking this particular lens on it was key to, taking this other lens was key to. Now then, when we factor these together, is there some higher order reconciliation that we can start to endeavor towards? And then recognize that will never be perfect, right? So there's a continuous process improvement where the confidence margin is always less than 100%. And there is active seeking of what it is we're currently missing. So you were talking about one of the things in culture was not just shared values, but shared beliefs. I would say that I mostly am interested in the types of culture that are more about the process by which we come to belief than the belief itself, and all the beliefs held softly enough that they can evolve with the input of new information.
I just love how deeply you've thought about bias correction, which makes a lot more sense to me than not having it biased in any way, because that's why I asked the question. I didn't think it's possible. But then there's the layer of the governance and incentive structures within the organization that I very much appreciate. So I think it's worth speaking to that quickly. You have a handful of ethical commitments. Maybe I'll just articulate them and we'll double click on a couple of them. So one is
Sure.
open access to all the content. I think that's a pretty straightforward one. Freedom from competing incentives. Why don't you say just a quick something about that one?
Well, I mean, this is a tiny little team trying to do some work, but we had to think about, there's a reason that everyone who is putting information into the information landscape of the media space, why there is so little trust. And so we wanted to think about what are a news organization has to pay for itself. And it either sells subscriptions, in which case appealing to the beliefs that keep people subscribing, or it sells ads. And, it's very hard to not have perverse incentive of some kind. And so we were trying to think about what are all the types of perverse incentive and how can we correct for all of them as best we can. And so we decided that we would do this as a pure nonprofit with none of the standard revenue models that an information project would have. So we're not selling the content the way that a subscription journal would, because even though we think that is better oftentimes than a ad model, if we're really trying to make open society possible, we don't want people's money to determine whether or not they have access to the information to participate civically. That the epistemic commons really must be a commons and must be managed with no other agendas. So pure nonprofit, and only those people who believe that this is a commons that should be supported will end up funding it, and we'll be able to do as much as we can do based on the funding we can get of that kind. So we're not selling ads, we're not selling the content, we're not selling people's data.
Right. And so then there's transparency of financial resources. You're structured as a 501c3. And to your point about competing incentives, you double clicked on this with one of the commitments, which is just freedom from donor influence. So it's all non-restricted support.
Yeah, if a donor wants to be able to say that they're supporting us, great, that's true. If they would like to have some place on our site or whatever where we discuss who our donors are, we're probably open to that. We haven't got there yet. If they want to influence our editorial process in any way, then it's an absolute no, we won't take their money. And that's already come up so far. And like it would just, that is antithetical to the goal of the whole thing. So
of course.
the support has to be that people actually believe in the project, and that's it. And so what that means is it's fucking harder to fund this thing because I foreclosed most of the funding methods. And so we are actively seeking people who believe in it and want to support it. We won't make compromises on this to be able to have scale. Like, that's a very easy political compromise to say, hey, what they're asking us to do is really minor and it allows us to fund the thing. We just won't do it. We'll just do less stuff. But we feel that it's critical that what we do has the best integrity we know how to create, and that that's more important than the scale consideration.
And that speaks to the next commitment, which is quality over quantity. And then I really appreciate this one. So I wanted to speak to it a little bit more because I think it just speaks to how carefully you're thinking about the incentive structure within the team and the implications of who's reading it, which is collective attribution of authorship.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not innovating here. Like, we're following practices that other groups have thought about that seemed to make sense here. So The Economist, for instance, has a lot of its writing with no specific bylines. We thought that was important for this project. So someone can go to the team page and see who's on the team, who's involved in writing. But there are no bylines on any specific article. There's a couple reasons for that, several reasons. One is, honestly, our editorial process, there is no one person writing these. There might be a lead author that kind of does first writing, but there are multiple different types of editing that are editing for the social theory, for the facts, for the quality of readability, for the citations. And even as far as the kind of theoretical framework goes, there is a deep intellectual process where everyone who has knowledge on the thing is contributing up front. So it really is being produced by a group collective intelligence process as best as we can. So it's just more honest to say that.
I love that.
The other reason, though, is that someone can't critique the article based on identity politics and ad homineming the person. You actually have to engage with the content of the article because we have people on our team of different races and different genders and different nationalities, and they're all contributing. But the content is the thing that we want people to engage with. The other thing is we're going to say things that are controversial, and we want to protect the authors from not having to not say what's true or be targeted. And we also don't want that if someone was going to be a primary author on a piece and have their name, that they would put more energy into that than where they're supporting another piece, just their own internal perverse incentive of identity. So structuring it this way, everyone is really just focused on the quality of the content of everything.
Oh, I love it. No, I just really appreciate, again, the incentive implications of that particular commitment. So related to that, you mentioned the authentic diversity of viewpoints and backgrounds, transparency and methodology. We've talked about just going under the hood and seeing what your modeling is to lead you to conclusions in the analysis. And then the last one is expiration of the project, which I really appreciate too. So why don't you speak to a little bit more to that one?
Yeah, this one is a little bit more challenging decision to make than the other ones, but we decided that we would give the project a 5-year time to live. So that's 5 years as of a week ago. I say it's challenging because there's not that much time to be able to try and have some of the effects that we want to have. Why did we consider that important? In one way, it seems stupid if you're going to do the work to actually try to build operational capacities in a team and trustworthiness, that you would kill that thing as opposed to continue with it. But for this purpose, it actually felt really important. Organizations end up having a desire to keep living independent of their ongoing utility. And we can see in the nonprofit space in particular, where this is a source of perverse incentive, that if we have a nonprofit that is managing some world problem, if it truly solved or obsoleted that problem, it would obsolete itself, and the power of everyone in there would go away. So the incentive of a system to keep being the system can be perverse. So we wanted to just get rid of that up front. Yeah. We wanted to make it clear that this will not be a part of the long-term power or media or institutional landscape. And it wasn't seeking such a position. And as a result, when the project closes, we're going to do a public postmortem of where we feel that we were successful, where we feel that we failed, so that other groups that want to do similar things can learn. Our ability to succeed at affecting culture, which is a long-term project, obviously has to continue past 5 years. So we're only successful if we help lots of other groups be more successful. So we didn't want any other groups to think, oh, we're trying to do something kind of like Consilience Project to their competitor. It's like, no, if you want to do something good in journalism or in education or in governance or whatever, we fucking want to help you if we can, limited only by our bandwidth, nothing else. To the extent we have bandwidth, we want to help any group doing meaningful things. And then the other thing is that for a cultural enlightenment, right, to truly be that, it has to become the zeitgeist of a time in a way that is totally decentralized. There is no control of the memes or the hashtags. It is actually the spirit of the time that lots of people are feeling and sensing and truly directed by the collective intelligence. So it's important that there isn't something like a center, right? So insofar as what we're doing had any kind of directive nature to it, it's important that it's temporary.
Right.
And so there are other reasons, but those are some of the main reasons for the finite time to live.
Well, that's naturally flowing into just the again, looking at it in the context of its role in a broader movement. And I know you've touched on it in the conversation, but why don't you speak to it just a little bit more?
Yeah, movement is a weird word. I use it sometimes because there's a sense that a movement is bigger than a particular organization or project. But most of the movements we can think of in recent times are like for a particular political party or a problem that again is pit
Higher up on the
against other
stack.
problems.
Yeah.
And so then those movements engage narrative warfare to try to win and things like that in culture war. What we're talking about, I think, like if we talk about a cultural enlightenment, we're not being naive to the fact that every previous cultural enlightenment had major problems. Of course, when we're looking at modernity, we're like, well, all of the destruction to the environment that happened because of the Industrial Revolution and all of colonialism, whatever, was empowered by that thing. So we're not pretending that it was something that it wasn't. And the same with the kind of Greek Hellenistic Enlightenment, but we can also look at the Hindu Enlightenment and Chinese Enlightenment and the Confucius Taoist times. And that when I think of a cultural enlightenment, what I think of is a time period where there is some increased access to knowledge widely, as opposed to just a priestly or a nobility or a limited class having access. And when there's some capacity that the culture as a whole values and invests in the knowledge and really the knowledge, virtue, and development of the people widely, that's roughly the thing we'd call cultural enlightenment. And the previous ones weren't adequate to what the world needs now. So we're talking about one that is different in kind. But that's what we feel is like it really is cultural enlightenment or bust for the world in the way we look at it, because anything less than a population that wants to build new systems and is capable of participating with them, not just systems, but things that are beyond systems, new capacities,
Yep.
and doesn't just want the rights associated, but is willing to take the responsibilities to make it happen. Anything less than that is still a dystopic failure mode. And because either you don't get the capacities or you get them with oppression, which is a different type of dystopia. So given that we're saying like cultural enlightenment or bust, we would say that like Dent is already a nascent expression of that thing, that there are people that come here to want to think about what is the future of capitalism and what's the future of democracy in a post-digital world. And we'd say that the social dilemma getting the huge scale of traction that it got is a sign of that. And we'd say that all of the awareness of fake news and could we establish some better kind of news, and like that there's a lot of little pieces of people recognizing the depth of the problem landscape, and that the information sphere, the culture sphere, is one of the places we have to work. We'd say that that kind of movement or enlightenment is starting. It's nascent, but it doesn't. The part that's focused on social media, the part that's focused on journalism, the part that's focused on the perverse incentives of capitalism don't necessarily recognize themselves as the same thing.
Yep.
And so how we reframe those is all working on necessarily integrated facets of the next phase of civilization and culture rising to be able to meet that. That's one of the things we want to help do, is that framing.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I do want to. I want to now get into the specifics of where where you're at right now with the project and what you need. But before we do that, I do have one question related to sense making. I had actually had a really interesting conversation, I don't know, a month or so ago with Allie and David from Rebel Wisdom. I know you've done a lot of videos with them, and your war on sense making is, a must watch that I've sent to everyone. Really, really insightful, really clarified my thinking on these topics. And we were just talking about sense making. And one of the other things that we've been touching on at Dent is, I'm sure you're familiar with Donella Meadows' work. I just find it so interesting how she talks about we actually can never understand the complexity of the universe. And to do the best that we can, we have to bring our whole humanity beyond our intellect and our intuition. One of the things I've come to appreciate just quite recently is the role of our gut and intuition. And we've looked at personal versus social change and turning inwards and just your intuition around the right direction. And this sense making that we've been talking about with Consilience feels very, very intellect dominant or exclusive intellect. We also talked in that conversation about the importance of having a sophistication emotionally or in your body or in your own just mindfulness to see, because some of these are hard conversations and they might trigger traumatic experiences. So having the sophistication to know, okay, my physiology is elevated, it's compromising my sense making. That sophistication feels important for sense making competence. Understanding that we're integrating with other components of sense making, not just intellect, feels important. So I'm curious just your take on those things as it relates to this meta question that you're addressing, which is the sense-making crisis.
Yeah, totally. This is why you were reading the kind of mission statement that's on the homepage, which is a work in progress because it's kind of accurate but not obvious what it means yet. But it said something to the effect of that we're focused on developing the full human capacities necessary to a culture that can give rise to institutions adequate to the problems. The full human capacities, not just the cognitive capacities. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not specifying in there what those full human capacities are because it's already a long sentence.
Yeah.
But you're mentioning some of them.
Yeah.
And this is why I said, ultimately, if we're trying to coordinate good choices are not just informed by our cognitive process. Mm-hmm. They're not just informed by our sense making, but by what we value in our meaning making and by lots of other subtler process. A lot of times our choice isn't really a choice. It's a reaction out of kind of emotional trigger. So to even have the possibility of choice, there has to be a level of mindfulness and capacity to both notice and work with those types of emotional and physiological responses. And so it seems like it's intellectual on the surface, but not really once you scratch a tiny bit, just intellectual.
Okay. Great.
Because if you're going to steelman another person's perspective, which includes both what they see in the world and their values, well enough to have a conversation that could actually lead somewhere, you're actually, the only way to do that is to really, really try to hear them. Yeah. And not just try to hear them, but try to inhabit as best you can, knowing that you can't, right? There's an epistemic humility and an epistemic commitment at the same time. Yeah. Most people there's an article on the site on the challenges of 21st century sense making currently, and it talks about that most people go from epistemic hubris to epistemic nihilism in one step. They're either certain they know what the world is, or when they see the complexity of it, they give up and don't feel like they can understand, or flip back to certain. And we have to walk something that is totally between those, which is holding the depth of uncertainty and the desire to progressively know better so that we can make better choices, knowing that we'll still never get to 100% certainty.
But this humility has come up a lot in our conversations too. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, so there's this epistemic humility and kind of moral humility, because it's so easy to be both certain and righteous, and that just makes you dangerous. Yep. Anyone who's certain and righteous is going to be part of a war, very likely. And so we need something that is more open, more curious. And curious doesn't mean not rigorous. I don't have to accept every idea to listen to it and try it on and to seek, is there some signal in it and maybe also some distortion or something missing. But yeah, if in order to do sense making that can go anywhere, I have to really try to listen to where someone else is coming from, and oftentimes not just to what they're saying, but if we're going to be able to present something that's viable, it's almost like the generator function of what they're saying.
Yeah, you have
to trying to sense into.
Understand the emotional landscape so that you can understand how they'll respond. Yeah.
emotional identity,
Yeah.
group affiliation, all
Yeah.
of those types of things to be able to say, could this actually work for them? If am I coming up with a proposition? And it's not going to be my job to do it. They're going to make a
Yeah.
counter proposition. But
Yeah.
am I even in, like, if I'm communicating, I'm seeking communion. And so it's
Yeah.
not the hubris to say, I can know what they're thinking. No, nonsense. It's the seeking communion that is real communication.
You know, it's funny. I just thought about identity and I thought to raise it. And then I thought, oh, I don't want to take us too sideways. But I think that this is an extra, you just mentioned it. So I'm glad you did. I think that this is an extraordinarily important piece of it because sometimes, well, oftentimes, maybe most of the time, these beliefs are tied to one's identity, which makes them much less mutable because it's an affront on one's identity to admit that those beliefs are wrong and evolve them. I'm curious your thoughts on that piece.
Yeah. So, you know, lots of philosophers throughout history have noticed that the soldiers on both sides of almost every war were certain their side was right. And in the, Protestant Catholic wars or whatever, you've got people praying to supposedly the same God to deliver the righteousness of their holy war. And so this kind of, I'm identifying with a group that is less than everybody and see other groups as in fundamentally but also inexorably rivalrous relationship. And my own sense of safety, security, belonging, okayness requires fealty dynamics that keep me from being able to hear other perspectives. That's part of war, right? That's part of, at minimum, culture war and the larger scope of economic and diplomatic and political and even kinetic war is part of that. If there's a tribe that's isolated and there's no other tribes very close, the people have to have at least their sense of identity bound with the other people in the tribe enough that they're willing to make certain compromises of what they would want most in the moment for what others want because they're going to do that for them. But they don't necessarily have to have an identity with the other tribes because they're not affecting them or affected by them. As soon as we start having other people, and not just people, obviously this also comes to the earth and the world in which we live beyond the human sphere, but we'll just start with the human sphere. As soon as there are other people that our actions are affecting, their actions are affecting us, if we don't identify with them, then we're going to be bound to rivalry. As soon as we get that exponential rivalry self-terminates, and that right now, the phone that we're all talking on was made on a 6-continent supply chain, that many, many countries, that we are all inexorably affecting everybody. And identity with anything less than everyone ends up being self-terminating, I would argue. And that
Yeah.
doesn't mean I can't have groups that I have more familiarity with. That's of course going to be the case, but it means that there is some kind of universalism that I am seeking as well, in addition to whatever groups I might happen to have more proximity to.
Okay, so let's talk about where you are now with Consilience. You just launched the beta.
Yeah, I happen to, you and I know each other. I happen to be on here speaking, but the whole team just launched the beta, and the whole team, there's a whole group of people before it was called the Consilience Project that were working together on what is the theory of change and how do we develop that. And so, just important I make that distinction. So yes, the beta just launched, and in all honesty, if it wasn't for fundraising, I wouldn't have even wanted it to launch yet. But we're, like we said, a nonprofit that is seeking only funds that are not conditionalized. And conditional, I mean, they can be conditionalized or tranched on, can we actually execute? That's fine. But so we raised just what we needed to get to a prototype, because since what we're talking about doesn't fit into a normal project category, and since it's oriented towards abstraction, we thought it would be reasonable for people to wonder, can these people who are oriented to abstract things actually execute? So we're like, well, let's go ahead and put something up. And then we'll raise the rest of the funds that we need, where we have at least a prototype and someone can get more of a sense of it. So we got that up, and consilienceproject.org, you can have a look. And it really is, like I said, quite early,
Yep.
up a week ago. In the theory pieces or the foundational pieces, the first one that you'll see on there is Democracy in the Epistemic Commons. And it's just explaining how an epistemic commons is a necessary thing for an open society in a way it isn't for a closed society. It's an antecedent. We've lost it. What does it take to regain it? That kind of thing. And it's a simple concept, but it's not well described in a concise way anywhere else. It's like embedded in lots of books of political philosophy. And so then the next one in that series was the unique challenges to the epistemic commons or to sense making in the 21st century. Why is this not the founding fathers' world of what it takes to make sense of the world? And so you can see there's a couple pieces in that foundation series. We actually have a list of the theoretical pieces that we're working on, like the next 60 of them. And we're going to get it up on the site soon because it'll give people a sense of the shape of where it's going. And we're seeking more collaborators that have depth of expertise and wisdom. So if someone has real expertise in these, we'd like them to reach out. And there's also a list of the situational assessments and the meta news that we're going to be doing. The few situational assessments that are up there, like China's activity in East Africa, or understanding what is uniquely different about French secularism than US secularism, they did not yet get to be applications of the social theory because we haven't written all the social theory pieces. They were really just showing we had a team of people with the kind of political and epistemic and journalistic and intelligence backgrounds to do good situational assessment. So really early prototype in that way.
You needed examples of each of the variant.
And it might seem like they are relatively randomly selected topics because to some degree they are. Like, why would we pick China and East Africa rather than China's activity in Latin America or in telecom or in the digital currency space? Why didn't we just start with the topic of US-China relationship shaping the power dynamic of the 21st century? That bigger piece is harder to do a really, really good job. You've got to factor what's happening in all the other places. And so we need more people and resources. So we started in that way. We will be building out the theoretical pieces largely first, and then the situational assessments. It's our goal to start with the kind of highest topic, highest leverage ones, like an overview of the current catastrophic risk landscape, AI risk, biotech risk, grid fragility risk, those types of things. Yeah, and all of it, how fast we get to it is based on resource dependence.
Sure. And then you did one meta news one, and I appreciated how you talked about how the meta news is particularly labor intensive, obviously, because you're looking at the entire landscape of the narrative around a particular issue.
Yeah, the meta news is a method that we prototyped, and obviously we'll keep getting better at the method as we go. We did not choose to try and take on something like climate change or vaccines or systemic racism that, like, the etiology of it is forever ago and millions of articles. We did, honestly, just for ease of ability to do it as a prototype. There was this topic during the George Floyd protests of bricks being used to break windows and like that, and the escalation from peaceful protests to riots seeming to have bricks involved. And there were these pallets of bricks, and were the pallets of bricks planted? And there were indications that there were agent provocateurs in some place. Did agent provocateurs also mean they were bricks? And the media landscape polarized over this for like 3 weeks. It was a major topic. The right said that Antifa did it, and the left said that white supremacists did it, and the mainstream news said it's a conspiracy theory and nobody did it. And then we just moved on to the next topic. And yet that particular, everyone believing rapidly very different things, without good epistemic process, it actually led to an increase in violence. The belief that the other side was escalating to violence or doing something that would make it look like our side was the side that escalated to violence actually helped an escalation to violence. And so it was just a very good example, but where there was really only like 3 weeks of stuff total. So we could actually get every single article and news piece ever written on it and use some ML tools and study the whole thing. So we did that. And we did apply some kind of big data machine learning tools to then be able to see what the total types of arguments were, and then analytic processes on those arguments, and be able to break down what is known and not known about the situation. How did the ideas trend? Where did some stuff look like an organic growth that actually looks like it was inorganically facilitated, that kind of thing. And then make generalized insights of like, what went wrong here? What went wrong in the epistemic process? And those generalized insights are object lessons to say, when you're looking at other things, look for this kind of thing. And our hope is actually we do a few more of those, and then we made the methods by which we're doing it open source, and we'll make in more detail open source. we would love for organizations that have better resources than us to take that on. Like this all open source. We would love for Reuters or some big news organization to take that kind of thing on and do it with the transparency that people could trust it, or new
Right.
orgs to do so. And so that one is really hopefully just an example of an open source prototype of a way to try to heal the fragmentation in the information landscape around polarized topics.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a prototype that's up. It's a very lightweight prototype that it gives us examples of these different variants, and then we've got a very long list of topics to cover. Let's talk about what you need right now. What kind of support do you need?
Yeah, great. One other thing I will say is we're not just writing long form articles. I forgot to say this part, and then I'll come back to the need. So the Consilience Papers, I was mentioning, we've got these 3 different kinds of papers, but they all interlink because if we're talking about the current state of education,
Yeah.
we need to reference in that one the other piece that is written on principles of civilizational and institutional decay so that people can actually apply and understand how institutional decay occurs. And et cetera. So there's like they interlink, and the goal is rather than write this as like some 3-volume huge ass book that nobody would read, that being able to write it in these articles means that whether someone's interested in entering through the perspective of education or economics or public culture or whatever, they can enter through lots of places. Even though an article is long for normal articles, for if you think of it as reading a book or a book chapter, like it's 30 minutes, 30-40 minutes, you can read it in one sitting. But it's deep enough that if you actually want to work in this space and make progress, you have a deep enough set of insights to actually be able to work with the space. And then you can follow the connections in the ways that you want.
I appreciate
So
that.
that's the interlinked papers. But then we still also want to make it available to more people. So we're already prototyping making animations, like a 15-minute animation that makes the same concepts available at a high school level, and other forms of kind of media translation that we would do in addition to, as we mentioned, other groups that get inspired by the idea and do their own thing with it, which is awesome, that we would support.
Yeah, this seems,
Okay,
I
so that
mean,
was the
this
last
seems
part.
rife for decentralization and also plugging into education. We've got Carolyn in the audience. She'll probably have some things to say about that.
Yeah, we like, you can imagine that in the same way you want to make an easier on-ramp for high school students, you also want to make a deeper version where someone could get a graduate training in the social sciences that would be the future social sciences needed. And so someone would maybe all of the articles would make up the basis of a graduate curriculum with the reference materials that are involved. So we already had one really great university talk to us about starting such a graduate program, and like those are the types of things that are very interesting partnerships. There's a lot of things that we will need that I really look forward to that we just can't get to yet because of bandwidth. So, things like, hey, you're working on a blockchain program and want to implement better governance technologies, and how can we work together on the design of those, or you're working on making a graduate program in the future of social sciences, or a new type of journalism. We have to increase our internal bandwidth as a team to do the partnership work because we already have this very fortunate position of more partnership interest than we just have bandwidth for. So really understanding what an early phase we're in. The thing we need right now is to actually grow our team by a number of people, both for publishing and for starting to do kind of partnership and just basic operations. So we're looking for a few key team members, and upstream from that is raising the capital to be able to do so. So we're in the position that a startup nonprofit would be in, of aligned donation is number one. People who can facilitate introductions of that kind even would be like number 1.5. With that then would be some of the right team members. Following would be advisors who have real expertise on some of these topics and who would be willing, when we're working on topics in their area, to give input. And then as we gain the capacity, people who can start thinking about how do we get this into different forms of media? How do we build technology and forums and whatever that help advance the conversation? Those are all things to come. So we're actually going to write up pretty soon what are the things we're hoping to get to on the site so that people who are interested can start to kind of submit, and we can get to that as soon as we're capable.
And then there were a couple of other things on the list too. around institutional partners. I guess that's part of helping with that, right? Also pro bono services.
Oh, yeah, pro bono services is basically another version of donation.
I guess. Yeah.
We have to pay for legal services to make sure that we're compliant and there's no trademark or libel or whatever types of issues. Of course, if someone had legal services to donate or, you know, other things like that. So there's a list of professional services. And if you have a professional contracting service that is relevant to a nonprofit, you probably already know that because that's come up before, in which case we probably have the same needs that most other ones do and would love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, that concludes our outline. I think we should wrap. We're here to support you and your work. And it's always such a pleasure to hear you speak and learn from you. We learn something new every time.
I mean, I'm in the fortunate position of having the floor with you and getting to share some things. I think the things that I'm thinking about are things that probably everybody here thinks about, cares about. So even a phrase like my work feels wrong. It feels like
Fair enough.
the work that we're all interested in. And this happens to be a project that feels like it has some potential right now, which is exciting. And
100%.
insofar as anybody feels aligned and can help with it, awesome.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what's been amazing about these conversations is it really has drawn an incredibly diverse community together with a shared social mission. And I think we all have our unique roles to play. And no, I appreciate that. That's a really important point. Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know that you have been very heads down on this for many, many months. As I said, I'm honored that this is your second Clubhouse appearance, and the first one was with me. It is an honor to host you. You know how much I absolutely adore you and always love to have time with you. So thank you so much.
There's a thought I just felt to share, and as you're saying this in terms of being heads down, because I am, and I guess it's something that I hope everyone is experiencing, and if not, I hope you know is a possibility to think about. Is you're saying it's an honor to be on here talking. I feel that. I feel like it's an honor to get to have a chance to possibly work on things as meaningful as we get to now. That
Sure.
previous humans didn't have a chance to work on things that could be as effective at the scale that this is. So in some way, it's like terrifying and overwhelming and whatever, but it's also really a fucking honor. And there's a way to be enlivened by your work because it's coming from a place of a depth of meaningfulness as opposed to taxed by it. And I hope everybody finds that.
I overflow with excitement every time we get together. So I certainly know what that feels like.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everybody here.
Daniel, thank you so much. Bring you back another time.